Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep. The vanishing of Atlantis, legend or memory. The sea is quiet tonight. A slow rhythmic hush rolls across the dark waters, the sound of a world that remembers what men have long forgotten. Beneath the endless surface of the Atlantic, where light fades into eternal twilight, lie the whispers of an island that once was, and perhaps still is, beneath the waves. They call it Atlantis, the lost realm of splendor and pride, a civilization swallowed whole by the wrath of the sea. The story begins, as so many do, with a voice from antiquity. Around 360 BCE, in the halls of Athens, the philosopher Plato told his students a tale recorded from an elder Egyptian priest, a story so ancient that even Egypt considered it old. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato described a powerful island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a land of wide plains and snow-tipped mountains, rich in gold, silver, and orichalcum, a metal that gleamed like fire. There, the mighty people had built temples that shone in the sun, harbors alive with ships, and palaces adorned with bronze and ivory. They called it Atlantis, named for Atlas, the titan who held the heavens. Plato said the Atlanteans were once noble, descendants of gods and men ruled by wisdom. Their capital was a marvel of geometry and grace, concentric rings of land and sea, guarded by bridges and gates, where fountains of warm and cold water flowed from the earth itself. Gardens flourished, statues rose in golden light, and the sound of music drifted through the night air. But as centuries passed, power bred arrogance, and the hearts of men turned from virtue to conquest. The Atlanteans, once lovers of truth and harmony, began to covet the lands beyond their own. Their armies sailed eastward across the sea, seeking to subdue the peoples of the Mediterranean. It was then that the gods, seeing their corruption, decided to humble them. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island was swallowed by the sea. For thousands of years, the world has debated whether Plato's story was a parable or a memory. Was it a philosopher's allegory for moral decline, or the faint echo of a cataclysm that truly occurred in prehistory? The answer drifts between myth and geology, between the philosopher's ink and the ocean's silence. Across centuries, countless explorers and scholars have searched for the lost realm. Some placed it near the Azores, where underwater plateaus hint at once sunken lands. Others pointed to the Mediterranean itself, to Crete, Santorini, and the shattered remains of Thera. In 1600 BCE, the island of Thera exploded in a fury of fire and ash, its Minoan civilization buried beneath pumice and sea. Could this be the memory that seeded the legend? When the eruption tore through the Aegean, it destroyed fleets, blackened skies, and sent waves across the coasts of Greece and Egypt. For those who survived, it would have seemed as though the world itself had drowned. In this way, perhaps, memory became myth. Yet, some whisper that the story is older still. Long before the Greeks, ancient peoples spoke of floods and vanishing lands. The Sumerians told of Eridu, the first city destroyed by rising waters. The Hebrews remembered Noah. The Hindus spoke of Manu, the lone survivor of a great deluge. Even in the Americas, tales of sunken worlds persisted, from the Mayans' lost Aztlan to the Aztec homeland said to lie beyond the Western Sea. Could all these myths be threads of a single memory, carried through time like driftwood after a storm? The ocean floor, silent though it seems, bears scars of catastrophe. Sonar maps reveal mountain ranges drowned beneath miles of water and plateaus that once saw the sun. The mid-Atlantic ridge rises like a vast spine through the sea, stretching from the Arctic to the southern oceans. Along its length are peaks and valleys, some now buried beneath silt, some crowned by volcanic cones. Scientists call it tectonic movement. Poets call it the graveyard of lost worlds. Those who dream of Atlantis often imagine an age before recorded time, when humankind had risen to heights long forgotten. They picture gleaming towers, advanced ships, and knowledge of the stars far beyond the bronze tools of early Greece. Some say the Atlanteans understood the movement of the heavens, could harness the energy of the earth itself, and possessed machines that hummed with the power of crystal light. Others dismiss it as fantasy, a projection of modern wonder onto the blank canvas of myth. But even fantasy is born from memory, and memory, no matter how faint, is rarely without origin. Imagine it then, as it might have been, the sun rising over vast marble temples, the scent of salt and lotus drifting through the air. Waterways gleamed like mirrors between golden causeways. Children chased one another through colonnades where the shadows of gods were carved in stone. Farmers tended terraced fields above the sea. Fishermen cast nets woven from flax and silk. Priests watched the stars from the tops of obsidian towers, tracing the cycles of the heavens to mark the days of planting and storm. They knew the rhythm of the earth, the subtle trembling before disaster. Yet even they could not stop what came. For days, the ground beneath Atlantis had murmured, a low growl beneath the song of the waves. Springs turned hot, and the air grew heavy with the smell of sulfur. Then, one night, the earth split open. The mountains to the north glowed red with fire, and rivers of flame poured down toward the sea. Temples shuddered, statues fell, and ships were flung against their harbors. Thunder rolled across the heavens, not from the sky, but from the sea itself. Falls of water rose in the moonlight, taller than the tallest tower, and the island trembled as though some ancient hand had struck it. In that moment, Atlantis ceased to be a city and became a storm. When morning came, there was only ocean. Fishermen on distant shores spoke of a strange glow beneath the waves for many nights after. Some said it was the fires of the earth, still burning below. Others swore they heard music carried by the wind, notes of sorrow and beauty drifting from the deep. Even now, sailors crossing those waters tell of strange sounds on calm nights, as if the sea itself remembers the voices of a vanished people. But if Atlantis was real, where did its survivors go? Many legends claim they scattered across the world, bringing fragments of their wisdom to new lands. The Egyptians told of Thoth, the god of knowledge, who came from across the sea bearing scrolls of sacred science. The Mayans spoke of a white-bearded teacher named Kukulkan, who arrived from the east and built their temples. In ancient Sumer, a being called Oannes was said to have emerged from the Persian Gulf, teaching humanity the arts of civilization. Perhaps these were echoes of the same memory, a diaspora of knowledge from a sunken world. Archaeologists have long searched for proof. Tools, writings, architecture, but the ocean keeps its secrets well. Beneath miles of silt and coral, whatever remains of Atlantis sleeps beyond the reach of divers and time. Still, discoveries emerge now and then that ignite the imagination. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar scans in the early 2000s revealed vast geometric structures nearly 2,000 feet below the surface. Pyramids, avenues, and domes, all arranged with eerie precision. Scientists debate whether they are natural formations or ruins too ancient to name. Off Japan's Yonaguni coast, terraces and stairways rise from the seabed, carved into basalt like forgotten monuments. And near Bimini in the Bahamas, divers discovered long lines of stone blocks stretching into the blue. Are these coincidences or reminders? The question endures because it speaks to something deep in the human spirit. The sense that history is older than we remember, that beneath every civilization lies the bones of another. Perhaps Atlantis is not a place, but a symbol. The diurnal cycle of rise and fall, creation and loss. Every empire imagines itself immortal, and every ocean waits. And yet, something in the world still hints at a deeper truth. The alignments of ancient monuments, the shared myths of floods and suns, and the sudden appearance of knowledge in early cultures all suggest that humanity remembers more than it can explain. Perhaps, far back in the mists of time, a real people once watched their world sink beneath the horizon, and their story became legend. What began as eyewitness became parable, then philosophy, and finally dream. Far from the Mediterranean, deep in the Atlantic, the currents whisper through canyons and over drowned plateaus. There, strange shapes loom in the darkness, stone pillars covered in coral, roads that lead nowhere. The ocean hums, its vibrations faint but constant, as though some echo of that vanished world still stirs below. If one were to listen closely, perhaps the sea would tell its story, not of gods or punishment, but of memory itself. And so the question remains, did Atlantis ever truly exist? Or does it live only in the space between memory and myth? Perhaps the answer lies not in the past, but in us, in the faint recognition that somewhere, once, humanity reached farther than we can now imagine, and paid the price of forgetting. The waves move endlessly. The stars above trace their old familiar paths. Somewhere below, a city sleeps, its towers draped in coral, its streets lit by the flicker of bioluminescent fish where torches once burned. And when the moonlight strikes the sea just right, the water seems to shimmer with outlines of rings and walls, as though the ghost of Atlantis still rises, waiting for a dawn that will never come. The currents shift, and we drift deeper into that silence where memory and ocean entwine. Imagine now the seabed, unlit but not lifeless. A vast plain of sand and stone where creatures glide through black water. To most, this is emptiness, but to the earth itself, it is a graveyard of worlds. Sediment layers tell stories in whispers of carbon and ash, each stratum a memory pressed beneath pressure and time. Somewhere among these ancient layers may rest the last trace of Atlantis. Modern science, cautious yet curious, continues to chase that echo. Geologists trace the tectonic scars that cut across the Atlantic basin. They speak of plate boundaries, of rifts and mantle plumes that could have swallowed whole islands. Oceanographers send drones and sonar arrays across the abyss, mapping each ridge and valley. Anthropologists compare myths separated by oceans yet bound by the same refrain, a world drowned, a people lost. What they cannot explain is how such stories persist in every corner of the earth. as if the trauma of one great flood was etched into humanity's collective soul. In Greenland's ice cores, tiny bubbles preserve the air of 10,000 years ago. Within them, scientists have found signs of sudden climate collapse, rapid warming, floods, and volcanic winters. Around 12,000 years before the Common Era, near the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose hundreds of feet as glaciers melted and the ocean reclaimed vast tracts of coastal land. Entire continents shifted shape. What if Atlantis was not one island, but many? Those coastlines swallowed by the returning sea? To the survivors, it would have seemed as though the gods themselves had destroyed their world overnight. Ancient ruins along the world's continental shelves support the thought. Off India's Gulf of Cambay, sonar revealed structures miles long beneath the silt, dated to millennia before Egypt's first pyramids. In the Black Sea, explorers found evidence that the sea had once been a freshwater lake before breaking through its walls in a catastrophic flood, an event that may have inspired the story of Noah. Each discovery blurs the line between myth and memory, suggesting that humanity has lived through cataclysms it barely remembers. Yet beyond the science lies something subtler, the way the story endures in our dreams. Every age rediscovers Atlantis in its own image. For Renaissance scholars, it was the ideal republic, wise and pure. For mystics, it was a realm of lost magic and crystal power. For modern minds, it is an allegory for technological hubris, the warning that progress without wisdom leads to ruin. Plato's moral survives even if the island never did. Civilizations rise, shine, and vanish. The sea of time swallows them all. Still, hope persists that Atlantis was real, waiting in darkness. Expeditions have crossed the globe in search of its bones. In the 19th century, Ignatius Donnelly, a Minnesota congressman turned historian, published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, arguing that all ancient cultures were descendants of that lost mother civilization. His words stirred the imagination of millions, igniting a century of quests. From the Azores to the Caribbean, from Morocco's coast to Antarctica's icy shelf, seekers have scoured maps and myths for a clue. Each generation uncovers something new, a shard, a ruin, a pattern, and though proof remains elusive, the legend grows stronger, not weaker. Why? Because Atlantis is not merely a place. It is an idea of perfection undone, a mirror held to every human age. It whispers that greatness always carries its own end, that pride calls forth the wave. In this way, whether it sank beneath volcanic fire or never existed at all, Atlantis endures as one of humanity's truest stories. Picture it now in its last moment. The ground heaves, the sea withdraws in eerie silence, revealing glistening sand and gasping fish where harbors once were. People flee toward the highlands, clutching their children, calling the names of gods who no longer answer. A sound builds, deep, immense, like the breath of the world, and the horizon rises into a wall of water. For an instant, the city gleams in the sun, towers of white marble and gold, reflecting light like mirrors of heaven. Then the wave falls. Silence. Centuries later, divers will swim above those same coordinates, unaware of what lies 1,000 fathoms below. The sand conceals streets once crowded with laughter, temples carved with constellations, and libraries filled with the knowledge of forgotten ages. Coral grows upon the lintels of doors that open to no air. In the stillness, a sea turtle drifts through a colonnade, brushing past inscriptions no eye will ever read again. And yet, even here, something remains, the pulse of history itself, faint but unbroken, perhaps in ways we cannot measure. Atlantis never vanished at all. Its knowledge, scattered like seeds, took root wherever survivors set foot. In the design of pyramids, in the myths of floods, and in the memory of stars mapped before telescopes, we see glimpses of its afterlife. Each civilization, in dreaming of its own origin, rediscovers that lost world within itself. The waves above shimmer once more, silver under the moon. To listen to them is to hear time breathing, to hear all that was and all that may come again. Atlantis may be legend, or it may be memory, but between the two lies truth enough to fill an ocean. The years passed, and the legend of the drowned world flowed onward through time like the tide itself, ebbing and returning in each new age. Empires rose, cities burned, and yet the story endured, whispering through the languages of priests, poets, and wanderers. Even as the marble temples of Greece crumbled and Rome's legions vanished into dust, the idea of Atlantis survived, as though some invisible thread kept its name from fading. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks copied Plato's dialogues by candlelight. Between the lines of Latin, they found not just philosophy, but mystery. What kind of place could have perished so utterly? What sin could call down such ruin? For them, Atlantis became a warning, a symbol of divine retribution, of paradise lost through pride. As centuries turned, the myth grew richer and darker, embroidered by storytellers who could not bear the thought of such a world simply disappearing. When the age of exploration dawned, the legend stirred again. Sailors crossing the Atlantic looked upon the endless horizon and thought of Plato's vanished land. Columbus himself, before setting sail for the Indies, wrote of a great island once swallowed by the ocean. His crew, staring into mist and foam, believed they might see the peaks of Atlantis rise from the deep. They never did, but the hope lingered. Every coral reef, every new shore seemed a possible remnant. In the Caribbean, stories blossomed anew. Spanish chroniclers returning from the New World spoke of ruins deep in the jungles of Central America, stone temples older than memory, cities whose builders had vanished like ghosts. Some claimed these were the colonies of Atlantis' survivors, scattered across the world after the flood. The Aztecs told them of Aztlan, the ancestral homeland across the sea. The Maya spoke of cities drowned beneath the waves. Even the Incas whispered that their first king came from the waters, bearing knowledge from a world long gone. To the native storytellers, these were not myths. They were memories. Their voices echoed something older than empire, older even than recorded time. The memory of a dawn when the earth shifted and the sea devoured its own. The Atlantic wind carries such whispers still. Fishermen in the Azores speak of strange lights beneath the waves. Off Madeira, sonar reveals terraces shaped like steps, as if the ocean had once lapped at palace walls. Along the Moroccan coast, ancient harbours lie far inland, where the sea once reached and then withdrew. The world itself seems to carry fragments of a forgotten geometry, scattered and rearranged like pieces of a shattered mirror. Yet, what makes Atlantis endure is not the stones or the sea. It is the dream of what it represents. The story of a people who reached beyond their limits and vanished, leaving only beauty behind. A reminder that civilization, no matter how radiant, always stands on the edge of the abyss. Imagine then that the ocean remembers. Picture the abyssal plain, vast and silent, where no light has touched for 12,000 years. The sand is as fine as dust. A slow current drifts, and something glimmers faintly beneath it. An arc of bronze, half buried, a carving of a bird whose eyes were once set with gems. It lies forgotten, the emblem of a kingdom erased. Around it, coral creeps like ivy across the remains of columns and courtyards. Anemones bloom where statues once stood. Fish pass through doorways, silver and silent, as though visiting a temple of their ancestors. There is no sound here except the slow pulse of the sea. But if one could listen deeply enough, not with the ears, but with the mind, perhaps a rhythm could still be felt. The faint echo of drums, the chant of priests, and the hum of a city breathing beneath the stars. The ocean has not forgotten. It never does. Scholars today continue to seek Atlantis, though in different ways. Some look not for a place, but for patterns. They trace ancient maps, alignments of megaliths, genetic migrations, and myths that recur with uncanny similarity. They find that human memory is older than writing, that tales of floods and vanished lands appear in every cradle of civilization. Could it be that our species itself remembers that deep within our collective mind lies a scar from a time when the world nearly ended? When the last ice age died, vast sheets of ice collapsed into the sea. The oceans rose, swallowing coasts where millions had lived. In a matter of centuries, whole continents changed shape. The Black Sea flooded, the Persian Gulf filled, the shores of India and Southeast Asia sank beneath the waves. It was, by every measure, a global Atlantis. For those who survived, the memory of that drowning would have burned itself into story and song. A story that became myth, a myth that became legend. Perhaps, then, Plato's tale was not invention, but inheritance. A memory passed down through millennia, reshaped by each culture that carried it. Egypt's priests remembered a kingdom that fell. Greece inherited the tale, and Plato, seeking meaning in the ruins of his own age, used it to warn of moral decay. In that way, the memory survived by changing its face, wearing new names and drifting like the tide from truth to metaphor and back again. Even now, as scientists scan the seafloor with satellites and submersibles, the myth breathes between the data. Patterns emerge, grids, ridges, shapes that defy pure chance. Some are dismissed as tricks of geology, others remain unexplained, but the allure is the same. The possibility that beneath the indifferent ocean lies proof that once, long ago, humankind was not alone in its infancy, that somewhere before the written word, a people had already built and lost a world. There is beauty in that idea. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a tide, rising, falling, and returning. The lost golden age, the sudden flood, the scattering of survivors. These are the rhythms of human memory. Atlantis may be gone, but its pattern repeats. We see it in the ruins of Babylon, in the fall of Rome, and in the cities reclaimed by jungle and sand. Every civilization writes its own Atlantis, and every sea waits to tell it again. And so the story becomes a mirror. When Plato wrote of the Atlanteans' pride, he was writing of Athens. When we speak of Atlantis today, we are speaking of ourselves, of the dream of perfection and the fear of losing it. The myth endures because it is never only about the past. It is about the fragility of the present, about how easily light can sink into darkness. Perhaps that is why the ocean feels so familiar when we gaze upon it. Somewhere in its vast reflection, we see what was and what will be. The tide does not lie. It remembers all that falls into it. The ruins of Atlantis are not only stone, they are the echoes of every voice that ever believed itself beyond fate. But still, the mystery invites hope. What if the city sleeps, preserved beneath layers of silt, waiting for the world to remember it? What if, in the quietest hours of night, when the wind is still and the sea smooth as glass, the outline of its towers can still be seen, faint and fleeting beneath the moonlight? The world at the bottom of the globe has always been a mystery. Even now, as satellites sweep its white expanse and research stations hum through the endless cold, something about Antarctica feels older than time. Long before its name was carved into maps, it existed only as rumor, the unknown southern land. Mariners believed that for the world to balance, there must be another continent far to the south, mirroring the great lands of the north. They did not know that beneath the ice, the balance they sought had already been broken once, long ago. Terra Australis Incognita. It begins with a map. In 1513, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis sketched a chart of the world. He claimed to have compiled it from ancient sources. Some Greek, some Phoenician, some perhaps older still. When modern historians examined it, they found something impossible. The lower edge of his map showed the coast of Antarctica, not as it appears today, frozen and buried beneath miles of ice, but as it would have been thousands of years earlier, ice-free and detailed in a way no sailor of the 1500s could have known. Mountains and inlets match the contour of Queen Maud Land, as revealed only centuries later by seismic surveys. How could a 16th century admiral have known the shape of a continent lost under 2 miles of ice? Some scholars waved the mystery aside as coincidence, yet others whispered that the Piri Reis map was a memory of a forgotten world. In the early 1800s, explorers such as James Cook and Fabian von Bellingshausen circled the southern seas. Their journals spoke of endless pack ice, of days when the horizon itself froze into glass, yet among their notes lay an unease. Cook wrote of earth-coloured snow, as though volcanic dust or ancient soil had bled upward through the weakness. In a few places his men found rounded stones, smoothed by water, on beaches where no river ran. It was as if Antarctica remembered rivers it no longer had. By 1911, when Amundsen reached the South Pole and planted the flag of Norway, the world congratulated itself on having conquered the last great wilderness. But a few of the scientists who followed him south began to sense that the continent's silence was not emptiness, it was concealment. Fossils of ferns and tree trunks emerged from the exposed rock of the transantarctic mountains, proof that this frozen place had once been green. Later, in the 1970s, drilling cores would reveal pollen from broad-leafed forests dated to 40 million years ago. Yet between the lines of those reports was another question. Had the warmth lasted even longer than scientists dared to admit? Long enough, perhaps, for humans, or something like them, to have walked those shores before the Great Freezing began. In 1939, a German expedition landed on the Queen Maud coast. Officially it was for whaling and mapping, but among the documents later declassified after the war, there were photographs of geometric shadows under the ice. Triangular forms too regular to be natural. Some dismissed them as crevasse illusions. Others, especially those who had seen the Piri Reis map, believed they had found the outline of ancient structures buried in the glacial crust. Half a century later, when satellites began measuring gravitational anomalies, they detected strange densities beneath that same region, shapes of stone unlike mountain ranges, clustered in hexagonal patterns beneath miles of compacted ice. To the public, these results were written off as data noise, yet a few researchers quietly passed the coordinates from one generation to another. The secret that linked them was a name found in an Egyptian fragment. The Nasura Tables, a set of broken inscriptions describing a land south of all lands where the gods had once hidden their halls. The hieroglyphs spoke of frozen waters above mountains and pillars that sleep beneath the white sky. For centuries it was assumed to be myth, perhaps a poetic metaphor for death, but the tables also included a sequence of star positions corresponding to roughly 10,500 BCE, the same alignment recorded on the Giza Plateau. If both sites referred to the same epoch, the implication was staggering. Civilization, as we define it, did not begin in Sumer or Egypt, but somewhere else, long before the last ice age ended. Modern geology tells us that around 12,000 years ago, Earth's climate changed abruptly. Ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose, and entire coastlines vanished. To most historians, this is the boundary between prehistory and history, the dawn of agriculture, the birth of settled life. But to a handful of fringe scholars and explorers, it marks something else. The erasure of a world advanced enough to leave maps, myths, and perhaps ruins, now locked beneath Antarctica's frozen cap. In 1958, when the International Geophysical Year opened Antarctica to global scientific collaboration, several nations began deep core drilling to study ice strata. One Soviet team working near Lake Vostok detected odd temperature gradients and magnetic interference. Their logs mention artificial heat signatures more than 2 miles down, as though some metallic body, warmer than its surroundings, lay buried there. The report was quietly sealed, and the team relocated. When Western scientists requested the raw data, they were told it had been lost in transmission. Decades later, satellite radar confirmed the existence of Lake Vostok itself, a vast body of liquid water trapped beneath 4 kilometers of ice, isolated for millions of years. And yet, at its eastern edge, sensors detected straight lines and right angles along the lakebed, the geometry of architecture, not geology. In 1999, a joint Russian-American project attempted to lower instruments through a borehole toward the subglacial lake. The feed transmitted for only seconds before cutting out, but those seconds were enough to show what looked like carved basalt walls descending into darkness. The images were dismissed publicly as noise, pixel artifacts. Unofficially, they were copied and stored under restricted classification. What lies beneath Vostok is still unknown, but some of those who saw the first data spoke of an arrangement resembling a city grid extending for kilometers. The idea of an Antarctic civilization was once dismissed as fantasy, a companion to legends of Atlantis. Yet if one steps back and reads the evidence not as myth but as memory, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Cultures from Egypt to the Andes preserve tales of luminous teachers, of gods who arrived from a land of ice, teaching astronomy and geometry, then vanishing when the world drowned. The pre-Incan legends of Viracocha, the Sumerian accounts of Enki, even the Hopi stories of the ant people, all speak of a race that survived a great flood by retreating beneath the world. Could these be echoes of refugees from a continent destroyed by the sudden onset of ice? Geologists studying Antarctica's crust have long noted its peculiar thickness, as if vast constructions or dense foundations once underlay it. The continent's bedrock is divided into two masses, East and West Antarctica, connected by a rift valley filled with volcanic ridges. Some seismic readings show cavities hundreds of meters tall within those ridges. Officially, they are lava tubes. Yet when the US Navy conducted Operation High Jump in 1947, a massive expedition involving ships, aircraft, and over 4,000 men, the mission's declassified goals included aerial mapping and testing of cold weather equipment. Unofficially, its logs describe flights encountering sudden warm air pockets, fog banks that interfered with compasses, and glimpses of dark openings in the ice cliffs. Admiral Byrd, who commanded the operation, later wrote in a private note that he had seen a land beyond the pole, lush and green, over which flew creatures unlike any known. Critics dismissed this as exhaustion or poetic metaphor, but Byrd's words, written before his death, include coordinates that point directly toward the sector where those gravitational anomalies still persist. Scientists today insist Antarctica has been buried beneath ice for at least 14 million years, but ice cores are dated by trapped atmospheric gases, not by the materials below. If a rapid crustal shift displaced an earlier temperate region southward, a theory proposed by Charles Hapgood in the 1950s and once endorsed by Einstein himself, then the civilization that mapped its coastlines could indeed have existed within human memory, later frozen in place when the continent slid into polar latitudes. Einstein's marginal note to Hapgood reads, "I find your idea fascinating, and it could explain much that otherwise appears impossible." To many, it remains just that, impossible. Yet explorers who have stood on the ice know that Antarctica defies ordinary time. In the silence between katabatic winds, there are moments when the air itself seems to hum, as if resonating with something buried deep below. Late in the austral summer of 2016, a Chilean research outpost detected low-frequency vibrations that repeated every 19 hours. Seismographs traced them to a point beneath the Wilkesland anomaly, a region already known for its magnetic irregularities. The waves pulsed like a mechanical rhythm, not a natural tremor. When the recordings were analyzed, the pattern matched the mathematical ratio of 3 to 2 to 1, a harmonic sequence often used in ancient architecture. The following year, satellite imagery of that same zone showed a circular depression nearly 400 kilometers wide, partially obscured by snowdrifts. To the untrained eye, it looked like an impact crater, but its edges were smooth, its center unusually flat, as if not from a collision, but from subsidence. Beneath it, gravity readings suggested a dense metallic structure 3 kilometers down. No natural process could explain its symmetry. When this data reached a handful of independent analysts, one of them, a geophysicist named Dr. Lena Voronin, compared the dimensions to known ancient sites. The ratio of its diameter to depth matched precisely that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, magnified 1,000-fold. She proposed that both were built upon the same geometric principles, a planetary grid once mapped by a civilization that understood Earth's energy lines. Her paper was quietly withdrawn from publication. Within months, she accepted a private research position in the Southern Hemisphere. She has not been heard from publicly since, and so the story returns to silence. The same silence that has always cloaked Antarctica. the silence of white horizons and buried time. But beneath the weight of ice and secrecy, the pattern remains. Maps that should not exist, magnetic fields that hum with artificial order, legends that converge on a single idea that our history began, not in the Fertile Crescent, but on a continent now locked in eternal winter. The ice does not forget, and in its depths the past waits, preserved in crystalline stillness. The ice does not forget. It holds every flake of fallen snow, every breath of vanished air. Layer by layer, year by year, it keeps its memories in silence. Beneath that silence, something older than memory still sleeps. In the austral winter of 2017, a multinational team quietly assembled under the guise of climate research. Their true purpose was buried within encrypted funding documents. Subglacial Structure Survey, Wilkes Land Sector. The team's base sat on a plateau of compressed snow, its prefab walls groaning in the wind. There were 12 of them, geophysicists, engineers, linguists, and one historian whose name appears nowhere in the official record. They were told they would be drilling to sample ice composition. They were not told what the coordinates truly signified. The borehole descended through 3 kilometers of ice, a smooth column of darkness lined with sensors. For days, the readings were normal. Pressure, temperature, mineral content. Then, one evening, the seismograph spiked. A pulse rippled upward from below, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of stone. Instruments registered an energy surge, brief, faint, but organized. The historian, a quiet man named Avery Holt, noted in his field journal, "The pattern repeats in harmonic thirds. This is not seismic noise. It is intention." When the drill reached bedrock, the bit struck something smooth, metallic, hollow. For a long moment, no one spoke. The geologist on duty wiped frost from the monitor, staring at the reflection of an impossible surface. Polished, curved, neither rock nor ice. They withdrew the bit, lowered a fiber optic camera, and saw darkness giving way to geometry. Parallel grooves intersecting at perfect angles. A doorway. Orders came from the sponsoring agency to halt operations and await instructions. Instead, the team sealed the radio room and continued. Their final transmission, later leaked, contained 4 words before static consumed it. "We are inside now." No official recovery team ever reached that site. Weeks later, a satellite flyover recorded that the entire outpost had collapsed into a sinkhole more than 100 meters wide. The coordinates were declared unsafe for further drilling. Yet in 2019, a Swedish research drone skimming low across the region captured faint magnetic interference at the same location, an oscillating field still active beneath the snow. What the lost expedition found has never been verified, but fragments of their data cache, recovered from a secondary server in Christchurch, revealed a series of images. Corridors carved from black basalt, their walls inlaid with metallic filigree that glowed faintly blue. One frame showed symbols etched into stone, spirals, triangles, and a form resembling an eye enclosed within concentric circles. Holt's notes attached to the file read simply, "Same sequence as Göbekli Tepe, mirrored." If true, it meant that the oldest known temple on Earth shared an inscription pattern with something buried beneath Antarctica. Göbekli Tepe dates to at least 9600 BCE, the very era when ice began to seize the southern world. Across the next few years, whispers spread through academic circles. A handful of climatologists who had analysed deep core anomalies were reassigned or retired abruptly. One, Dr. Amira Chen, gave a single interview before vanishing from public life. "The isotopic data doesn't lie," she said. "Something released heat from within the continent about 12,000 years ago, fast enough to melt localized sections from below. Not volcanic, not tectonic. Controlled, as if the land defended itself." When asked what she meant, she only replied, "There are mechanisms under that ice older than us." The notion of mechanisms would have seemed absurd a century earlier, but radar mapping in the 2020s uncovered regular rectangular voids stretching in linear paths hundreds of kilometers long beneath the Ross ice shelf. Officially, these were interpreted as subglacial channels. Unofficially, a few analysts compared their spacing to the street grids of ancient cities. One even overlaid the pattern upon a transparent projection of Plato's description of Atlantis. The ratios matched within 5%. The legend of Atlantis had always pointed west, toward the Atlantic, yet Plato's original Greek text never specifies an ocean, only beyond the Pillars of Heracles, southward where ice and fire meet scholars. Later assumed this meant the Strait of Gibraltar, but some linguists now argue that beyond the pillars could refer to the southern pillars of the world, the limits of navigation, the edge of the known sea. Perhaps he meant the Antarctic. In 2024, during an unprecedented heatwave, a section of the Thwaites Glacier calved, exposing dark stone beneath. Satellite photographs showed angular formations protruding through the ice, rectilinear, tiered, distinctly architectural. Within days, the imagery was scrubbed from public databases, replaced by lower resolution composites. But not before several researchers downloaded the originals. One geologist described the formations as step pyramid fragments the size of city blocks. Another noted an unmistakable feature, a colossal archway oriented toward true north. True north, not magnetic. Whoever built it had understood planetary geometry long before compasses existed. The story might have ended there, folded into myth again, if not for what followed. As the glacier retreated further, a subglacial cave opened near the Weddell Sea. Inside, expedition drones recorded air temperatures far above freezing and a faint luminescent haze. When the footage was analysed, it revealed crystalline pillars rising from an obsidian floor, each carved with glyphs that pulsed faintly, almost like breathing. Spectral analysis suggested the light came from bioluminescent microorganisms, but the pattern of their glow repeated mathematical sequences found in human DNA. No one could explain how life had survived there, sealed off for millennia, yet perfectly adapted to emit coded light. Some speculated that these organisms were descendants of surface species trapped during the sudden glaciation, evolving in isolation. Others whispered that they were engineered, biological recorders left behind by the civilization that vanished. The oldest myths on record, Sumerian, Mayan, Egyptian, all speak of beings who preserved knowledge through light and sound. Perhaps in this cave beneath Antarctica, that metaphor had always been literal. Holt's recovered journal pages end abruptly, but his final entry reads, "Language is vibration. If they stored it in living cells, it would last forever." After 2025, multiple governments restricted civilian flights over several Antarctic sectors. The official explanation cited environmental protection. Yet private satellite operators noticed new installations, rectangular facilities buried under white domes, their layouts aligned precisely along ley line coordinates identified by Hapgood decades earlier. Energy signatures from those sites corresponded to microwave transmissions, bouncing between stations in rhythmic bursts. Whatever was being studied, it was communicating with itself. As years passed, climate change exposed more of the continent's hidden past. Petrified forests emerged from melting ice cliffs. Beneath them, scattered obsidian fragments shaped like tools. Carbon dating was impossible. The material was too old, its isotopes long decayed. But under electron microscopy, each shard revealed microscopic engravings, fine, spiraled grooves resembling a kind of data storage far beyond primitive carving. Scientists from the University of Melbourne compare them to optical discs, capable of encoding vast information in three-dimensional lattices. "We might be holding their library," one researcher whispered, "and we can't even read the cover." The deeper the ice retreated, the clearer the pattern became. Symmetrical terraces, parallel ridges, and in one case, a perfectly circular depression 2 kilometers across, its rim dotted with monoliths. The arrangement matched the lunar cycle when viewed from the sky. Whoever designed it had built the calendar you could see from orbit. In time, the debate shifted from if to who. Some believed these were the last survivors of an antediluvian culture that spanned the globe, a civilization destroyed by its own mastery over nature. Others proposed that what lay beneath the ice was not human at all, but something that preceded humanity, guiding its evolution through encoded myth. Yet the quiet consensus among those few who had seen the data firsthand was simpler, and perhaps more haunting, that our ancestors once knew this place, called it home, and lost it to a catastrophe they could neither prevent nor fully forget. When people settled again in warmer lands, they carried fragments of that memory, stories of floods and shining teachers, of stars that guided builders to recreate what had been lost. Egypt's pyramids, Tiwanaku's temples, the Nazca lines, even Stonehenge, each a faint echo of the geometry first perfected in the far south. The blueprint of civilization itself may have been Antarctic in origin. By 2035, an independent research collective named Project Eternum announced a startling discovery. Beneath the Ameri ice shelf, sonar readings revealed a vast dome structure composed of interlocking hexagonal plates. Each plate resonated when struck by seismic pulses, producing harmonic tones that modulated across frequencies similar to human speech. When the team transmitted simple sine waves back into the ice, the structure responded, altering its frequency as if in dialogue. Within hours, the collective's online data feed went dark. Official channels denied the experiment had ever occurred, but a backup of the transmission, circulated quietly among academics, captured the final exchange. The returning signal formed a pattern that, when converted into visual spectrum, revealed a single image, a spiral galaxy centered upon a triangle pointing upward, mirrored by another pointing down, the symbol of above and below. As above, so below, the oldest sign of balance. It was as if the ice itself had spoken, reminding us that what was lost still endures in reflection. Today, Antarctica remains closed to nearly all unsanctioned exploration. Researchers work under strict observation, their findings filtered before publication. Yet satellite anomalies continue to appear. Heat blooms where no volcanoes exist. Magnetic lines that pulse in sync with lunar cycles. Every decade, new theories emerge and fade, but the whispers persist. The map was right. The myths were memories. The ice is only a veil. If one could stand at the South Pole on a windless night and listen closely, perhaps they would hear it, the faint hum rising through the frozen earth, like the low note of an immense instrument tuned to the heartbeat of the planet. Some say it is the cry of shifting glaciers. Others, the breath of a civilization dreaming beneath its own tomb. Imagine descending through the miles of ice, through centuries of snowfall compacted into translucent glass. The air grows warm, tinged with mineral sweetness. Below, light glimmers, soft, blue, alive. You step into a cavern vast as a city, its walls carved with spirals that seem to move when you breathe. A river of liquid water winds through arches of obsidian, reflecting constellations no longer visible in the night sky. In the center stands a pillar engraved with patterns that match the human genome. At its base, the words, or their ancestor, spiral inward. We became the memory, so the world would begin again. Perhaps that is the hidden truth of Antarctica. Not merely a lost civilization, but a seed vault of consciousness, preserved in ice until humanity was ready to remember. Every myth, every fragment, every inexplicable leap in knowledge may be echoes awakening as the planet warms and the veil thins. And maybe, one day soon, when the last sheet of ice slips into the sea, the halls beneath will breathe again. Machines will hum, lights will rise, and the forgotten architects of the world will look upon their descendants and know that the long winter has finally ended. Until then, the continent sleeps, its mountains whispering beneath auroras, its lakes sealed in glass, its truths frozen between time and silence. The wind that circles it carries an ancient rhythm, the same measured pulse, felt by every explorer who has ever stood upon its threshold. The ice does not forget, it waits, and somewhere deep within that waiting, humanity is listening back. The curse of King Tut's tomb. The sand remembered before anyone else did, long before cameras and cables and telegrams reached the Valley of the Kings. The desert knew the shape of a young king's sleep. It knew the curve of the hidden corridors, the sealed chambers, the gold resting in the dark like trapped sunlight. For centuries the wind passed over that buried door and whispered against rock and cliff, as if reciting a name no living tongue could still pronounce correctly. On a cold November morning in 1922, the sand tightened its grip as strangers came again with picks and brushes and patient hands. Howard Carter stood on the uneven ground, boots powdered with dust, gazing at the steps they had uncovered. For years he had searched this slope below the tomb of Rameses VI, certain that something lay hidden where others said the valley was exhausted, picked clean by earlier expeditions. His recent seasons had been little more than scraping and disappointment, his patron Lord Carnarvon growing impatient, the money nearly gone. And then, at last, a stone step had emerged, then another. Now, a staircase led down into shadow. The workers cleared debris with careful movements, baskets of rubble passing hand to hand like a slow river. The sun shifted across the cliffs, casting pale light into the cut in the rock. As the last of the sand was cleared, a door appeared, rough plaster over ancient stones, bearing the impressions of seals. Carter felt his breath catch. The oval of a cartouche was visible, faint but unmistakable. It carried a name the world had almost forgotten. Tutankhamun. For a long moment, no one spoke. The valley was strangely silent, as if even the wind were holding still. Carter stepped closer, lantern in hand. He traced the delicate impressions with his eyes, not daring to touch. In that quiet, he thought of all the centuries that lay between the moment this door was sealed and this morning's thin winter light. The toppled dynasties, the kingdoms risen and fallen in distant lands, the languages born and dead. Behind that door, a boy king slept in a darkness so complete that even time had learned to step carefully around it. He also thought of the old stories. Every archaeologist in Egypt knew them. Tales of curses carved into stone and painted on walls. Warnings written in looping hieroglyphs by priests who believed their words would be heard by gods and men alike. Most were simple appeals for respect, formulaic lines asking the living to honor the dead. But sometimes, in the corners of tombs and temples, more vivid threats appeared. Promises of scorpions, of crocodiles, of divine vengeance on anyone who disturbed a sacred rest. Carter did not believe in curses. He believed in evidence, in careful work and meticulous records. And yet, as he looked at that sealed door, even he felt the weight of eyes that were no longer there. He ordered the entrance sealed and set guards upon it. Night fell over the valley, cool and clear. 1,000 stars looked down on the rock and sand, as they had on the night this tomb was once closed. The desert listened. Far below, wrapped in linen and resin, a king still slept. Long before this night, in a very different Egypt, the palace in Thebes had smelled of lotus, incense, and uncertainty. Tutankhamun was not born to his throne with the calm inevitability of older kings. As a child, he had watched grown men argue in corridors and behind half-closed doors, voices sharp with theology and fear. The great experiment of his probable father, Akhenaten, had shaken the old world. Temples abandoned, gods pushed aside, a new sun-focused worship imposed like a rigid beam of light across a country that had always preferred a sky full of deities. By the time Tutankhamun, the boy with the Aten in his name, was old enough to understand anything, the reaction had already begun. Priests and generals, scribes and nobles spoke in hushed tones of returning to the old ways. The boy's name itself changed, Aten becoming Amun, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, a child symbol of restoration. He remembered the first time an older priest bent low before him, eyes never quite meeting his. As he recited words the boy king did not yet fully understand. He remembered heavy crowns that made his neck ache, the taste of ceremony and ritual and duty. Behind the walls of the palace, musicians played, servants hurried with trays of food and wine, and the lives of common people in fields and villages went on almost unchanged. But at the heart of it all was a young body that would not last long. Tutankhamun limped sometimes, his left foot twisted, his hands delicate. He was not one of the broad-shouldered warrior kings carved on temple walls, smiting enemies in perfect symmetry. In private, when the doctors had gone and the prayers were finished, pain crept into his bones like unwanted company. He learned to smile through it, to stand when the rituals demanded he stand, to sit on gilded thrones with the dignity they required. He also learned fear, not of enemies at the borders, nor of rebellions in distant provinces, but of a quieter and more relentless thing, the awareness that his life felt fragile, as if some part of him were made of thin glass set in gold. In the cool hours of the night, when palace courtyards grew quiet, and the moonlight fell in pale sheets over the Nile, he would sit by open windows and listen to the water. He wondered what songs would be sung of him when he was gone. In the temple precincts, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls. They wrote names, titles, offerings. They wrote spells for the journey after death, instructions for heart and soul, maps for the pathways between worlds. In their script, ink was a kind of magic, the flowing black lines giving shape and endurance to breath and thought. Within those scrolls lay the beginnings of what would one day be called a curse. When Tutankhamun died, likely not yet 20, the palace did not wail openly at once. There was too much work to attend to, too many rituals to be performed correctly. Death in Egypt was not an abrupt end, but the start of a long and carefully managed transformation. The boy who had been a king needed to become a god, or something close to it. In workshops along the Nile, goldsmiths hammered sheets of precious metal, soft and resonant. Artists carved wood and stone. Glassmakers shaped amulets in deep blues and greens, colors of the Nile and the sky. Linen was prepared in vast quantities, fine and white, to wrap the royal body in layer upon layer of protection. In a hidden valley on the west bank, workmen chiseled deeper into the rock, expanding a tomb that may at first have been intended for someone else. The corridors were carved quickly, but with care, the burial chamber painted in bright pigments that would glow in lamplight as priests chanted the words that guided a soul into eternity. Among those who labored in the half-lit tomb was a man named Menon, a scribe of the necropolis. His job was to supervise the writing of the spells on walls and coffins to ensure that every hieroglyph was correct. A single misdrawn sign could, in theory, confuse a god or misdirect a soul. Menon believed in the deep and quiet way of those who had known the old stories since childhood. He believed that words had power beyond the breath that spoke them and the ink that recorded them. He believed that a tomb, properly protected, could endure for all ages of the world, sheltering its occupant from hunger, darkness, and the restless dead. He also believed in consequences. One evening, after the other workers had left for the village and the lamps burned low, Menon remained alone in the burial chamber. The walls around him were nearly finished, images of the young king before various deities, scenes of offerings, of transformations from mortal to divine. The painted Tutankhamun held hands with gods whose names echoed back to the dawn of Egyptian time. Menon dipped his brush in ink and hesitated. He thought of the years to come, of greedy hands that might someday pry open this door, steal the gold, strip the king's grave goods, and leave his body exposed to dust and strangers' eyes. Egypt's own history told such stories. Older tombs had been robbed even in ancient times. Menon had seen broken coffins, scattered bones, burial chambers stripped bare. He'd felt the sadness in those violated places like a chill. Quietly, he began to write a line of words, not part of the standard funerary formulas, but born from his own fear and devotion. It was not a spell in the strictest sense. It was a warning, a thread of anger and plea braided together. It called on the gods of the West, on Anubis who watched over mummification, on the cobra goddesses of flame and venom, on the guardians who stood at the gates of the underworld. It promised that any who disturbed the king's eternal sleep without the proper rituals, without respect, would feel the wrath of those forces. He did not write the line prominently. He tucked it into a less obvious place along the base of a shrine, near the foot of a guardian statue. He wrote it the way one tucks a whispered prayer into a crack in a wall. When he was finished, he set down his brush and listened to the quiet tune. The air smelled of plaster, pigment, oil. Somewhere outside, faintly, came the sound of workers talking, a donkey braying, the small life of the village. Down here, in the cool heart of the rock, the king slept among images and words. Meenan pressed his hand gently to the wall. Rest, Nebkeperura, he murmured, using the king's throne name. May those who love you remember. May those who would steal from you be turned away. He did not know that his small additions and the standard protective formulae of priests would one day become a single idea in distant minds. The curse of the pharaoh. Time moved forward in a slow, grinding way. Dynasties fell. Libyans and Nubians, Persians and Macedonians, Romans and Arabs would all, in their turn, walk the Nile's banks and claim power over the land. The old language changed shape, then went silent on the tongues of ordinary men. Temples were abandoned to sand and swallows, their columns standing in fields like forests of stone. In the Valley of the Kings, rock slides and drifting sand hid entrances. Some tombs remained known and were plundered again and again. Others vanished entirely from memory. Tutankhamun's small, cramped burial place, tucked in a spot later partly overbuilt by workers' huts and debris from other excavations, slipped into a deeper kind of obscurity. For long centuries, no human hand touched his painted walls. The curses, such as they were, slept with him. In the 19th century, strangers came from cold northern countries, fascinated by mummies and monuments. They cut great obelisks from temple courtyards, packed sarcophagi into crates, and sent them floating down the river on boats. They admired Egypt's ruins, but saw them through a lens of their own desires. For knowledge, for prestige, for curiosity satisfied and stories told at their own firesides. From this fever grew Egyptology, a more careful, if still imperfect, study of the ancient land. Men came with notebooks and measured drawings, with methods that tried to be scientific, even as their hearts raced at the sight of gold. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was riddled with trenches, paths, and half-cleared entrances. To many it seemed exhausted. To Carter, who'd walked its cliffs for years, sketching every scrap of pottery, every chipped stone, there were still small shadows that did not feel empty. That is why, on that November day, he found steps where no one else thought to look. As the sun sank that evening, Carter sat in his tent, writing in his diary. The valley outside was growing cold, the rocks taking on a bluish cast. A single lamp burned on his table, its flame steady. The small yellow canary he kept in a cage near the entrance stirred on its perch, fluttering briefly before settling again. The bird had been a cheerful presence through long seasons of tedious digging. Local workers sometimes called it the golden bird, a bringer of luck. Perhaps, they said with half smiles, it would lead them to gold like itself. Carter did not entirely encourage such talk, but he did not discourage it either. In a place as harsh as this, hope was worth feeding. Later, when the valley was quiet and the men were asleep, a shadow slid past the tent. A faint movement, no more than a ripple of darkness, passed near the cage. The bird awoke with a sudden, terrified flutter, beating its wings against the bars. Carter, still awake, looked up sharply. A cobra, drawn by the small warmth and scent of life, had slithered into the tent. Its hood flared, scales catching the lamplight in a pattern like old bronze. For a moment, its eyes and the bird's met. In one swift strike, the snake lunged at the cage. There was a flurry of sound. A shrill note cut abruptly short. Carter leapt to his feet, knocking over his chair, but the cobra had already turned, body rippling, and vanished again into the folds of canvas and night beyond. He stood very still, listening. The desert outside was silent, the stars indifferent. In the morning, when news of the dead bird and the cobra spread among the workers, whispers rose like a low wind. The cobra, they reminded one another, was the symbol that once crowned the brow of pharaohs. To have one kill the golden bird on the very night a royal tomb was found. It was no wonder that some muttered of omens, of old protections stirring around a long-buried king. Carter, practical as always, ordered the tent inspected and precautions taken. But even he, writing in his notebook later, could not help mentioning the incident with a faint shiver of awe. The curse, if such a thing existed, had not yet spoken in words, but small patterns were beginning to weave themselves into a story. Days later, when Lord Carnarvon arrived from England, the valley woke early. Vehicles rattled over the rough track, raising little clouds of dust. Supplies were unloaded, greetings exchanged. Carnarvon, pale from ill health, but bright-eyed with excitement, stood with Carter at the top of the cleared staircase. "So, this is it," he murmured. "After all these years?" Carter nodded. "This is it." They descended the steps together, the air growing cooler with each one. At the sealed door, workmen held lamps. Shadows danced across the plaster, over the ancient seals pressed with the Jackal-o'-Nine captives emblem of the Necropolis Guards. Carter's heart thudded in his chest. He ordered a small breach made in the upper corner of the door. Carefully, gently, the workers chipped away at the plaster and stone. A little puff of air sighed out, touching their faces, a breath from a space that had not felt open air for over 3,000 years. Carter raised a candle and slid his hand into the gap, widening it just enough to peer through. His fingers shook slightly as he shielded the flame and pressed his eye to the opening. At first, he could see nothing but darkness. Then, shapes began to emerge, strange animal forms, glints of gold, wooden furniture piled in apparent confusion, but intact, unburned, unbroken. He took in the sight in a long, stunned moment. Carnarvon's voice came softly from behind him. "Can you see anything?" Carter did not look away. "Yes," he whispered. "Wonderful things." Words were carried back up the staircase, out into the bright air, and then outward still, across telegram wires and newspapers, into a world hungry for marvels. The boy king who had once feared being forgotten was about to be remembered with an intensity he could never have imagined. But in the valley, in the tight corridors of the tomb, the presence of so many new breaths and footsteps stirred something else. In the darkness behind the walls, the painted eyes of gods and guardians seemed to watch. Somewhere, far beyond human hearing, a line of ink laid down by Manin centuries ago, sharpened like a drawn blade. The first chamber was only the beginning. Once the officials from the Antiquities Service were present, and the formalities observed, Carter and his team began the slow, careful work of clearing the antechamber. It was filled with objects, crowded together like the contents of a storeroom hastily arranged. Chariots with gilded poles, couches shaped like animals, boxes and chests painted with hieroglyphs, and scenes of hunting and ritual. Everything was coated with a soft, intimate dust, as if the air itself had been sleeping. There was no sign of earlier looting, no smashed containers, no hasty damage. It was as though the tomb had been sealed and left untouched since the day of burial. As the lights of their electric lamps swung across carved surfaces and gold, the objects appeared and vanished in pools of brilliance and shade. Carter moved among them with a mixture of professional focus and almost childlike wonder. Each piece needed to be documented and stabilized before removal. The process was painstaking, weeks stretching into months. At the far end of the antechamber, great gilded couches stood before another sealed doorway. On it were plaster and seals again, with impressions similar to those on the outer door. Here, perhaps, lay the burial chamber proper. But Carter was cautious. He knew that the slightest haste could damage fragile artifacts. He also knew that the world was watching now, its attention a pressure on his shoulders, heavier than any stone. Outside in Luxor and Cairo, in London and New York, people began to tell stories before they knew the facts. They spoke of the curse that must surely guard such a perfect tomb. Reporters, eager for dramatic copy, repeated old tales of inscriptions promising death to anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Some of those inscriptions existed, carved in other tombs and temples, their phrases borrowed and bent to serve new narratives. In one Cairo newspaper, a particularly vivid line was quoted: "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." No one could quite see where exactly it had been found. It did not matter. The story found its headline. In the valley, the workers continued their careful labor, their breaths puffing in the cool air of the tomb, their hands steady even as whispers of curses drifted in their wake like dust. Some of them wore small amulets under their shirts, the old symbols of protection passed down in families that had lived near these ruins for generations. They respected the past in a way that did not separate belief from daily life. To them, the idea that a king might guard his own grave with unseen forces was not absurd. As they carried out shrines and chests, as they recorded the positions of every small object, they sometimes paused, listening to the odd creaks of shifting timbers, the muffled sighs of the tomb adjusting to new air. It was easy in those moments to imagine that the dead were turning in their sleep. One evening, as the sky above the valley darkened and the rock faces glowed briefly red before plunging into shadow, Carter stood alone at the entrance to the tomb. He looked down at the cleared steps, at the open door, at the flimsy wooden frame that now supported a canvas flap. He thought again of Minin. Though he did not know his name, he thought of the priests and workers who had sealed this place, perhaps with relief, perhaps with sorrow, perhaps with a sense of finality. He wondered what they would make of the scene now. Cameras, wires, crates, foreign voices echoing in their sacred valley. He also thought of Tutankhamun himself, the boy buried below. Would he have welcomed this sudden burst of attention after centuries of silence? Or would he have recoiled from it, preferring the steady, absolute dark? The wind moved gently against his face, carrying the dry scent of stone. Carter turned back into the tomb, the light of his lamp vanishing as the valley slipped into night. Part 2. Second half of the continuous story, flowing directly from Part 1, when, at last, the sealed door to the burial chamber was broken through, it was done with all the solemnity they could muster. Officials gathered again, their European suits and Egyptian robes, making a strange procession in the narrow corridor. Candles flickered alongside electric torches, the old and the new sharing space uneasily. The air that escaped from the newly opened gap was cooler still, tinged with something sweet and resinous. Carter moved forward, heart pounding. He widened the opening and stepped through into the chamber. The sight that met his eyes held a gravity beyond even the wonderful things of the antechamber. Before him rose a great shrine of gilded wood, filling much of the room, its surfaces covered with protective texts and images of goddesses with outstretched arms. It was like a golden house within the stone one, layer upon layer of sanctuary, protecting the thing at its heart. Around it, walls painted in deep colors showed scenes of ritual. The young king greeted by deities, embraced by Osiris, the god of the dead, his face painted green for rebirth. The figures, lit by the quivering light of lamps, seemed almost to move. Beneath the floor, beyond the shrine, wrapped in coffins nested like Russian dolls, lay the body of Tutankhamun. But that would take time to reach. Each layer had to be opened with care, each inscription copied, each object photographed and described. In the coming months and years, as they worked through those layers, the outside world grew more and more entranced, and more convinced that something dark watched from within all that gold. It did not take long for the first major death to feed the growing legend. Lord Carnarvon, whose money had fueled the excavation, was not a strong man. He had come to Egypt in the first place to escape the damp winters of England that worsened his health. In early 1923, some months after the breakthrough into the burial chamber, he was in Cairo, staying at the Savoy Hotel, enjoying the strange mix of modern luxury and ancient wonder that the city offered. One evening, while shaving, he nicked a small mosquito bite on his cheek. The wound became infected. In an age before antibiotics, infection could still be a dangerous visitor. Fever followed, then delirium. Doctors tried their best, but the illness deepened. Newspapers were already watching every move connected to the tomb. When word spread that Carnarvon was gravely ill, they scented a story. The line about swift wings was repeated, embellished. Some papers claimed that at the moment of his death, the lights in Cairo flickered or went out, a dramatic touch that would be retold for years, though evidence for it was thin. Carnarvon died in April 1923. In a house on the far side of the world, in England, his favourite dog reportedly howled and collapsed at the same moment, never to rise again. The tale spread fast, a faithful animal feeling its master's passing across continents. It did not matter whether the exact timing was true. It felt true to those who wanted the story to have weight. In Egypt, those who'd always believed in the power of names and bonds were not surprised. For the newspapers, it was irresistible. A man dies soon after opening a royal tomb. A mosquito bite, a trivial injury, becomes a fatal wound. The old gods, it seemed, had chosen an unlikely weapon, not a lightning bolt or a sudden collapse in a dark passage, but a tiny insect and the patient, relentless work of infection. Columnists wrote of the curse of King Tut's tomb. In the valley, the workers continued their labour, but the mood had shifted. Some looked over their shoulders a little more often. Some murmured prayers under their breath as they passed certain thresholds. Others, more skeptical, or perhaps simply more tired, shrugged and kept working. Life was hard, and death always close. Curse or no curse. Carter, for his part, bristled at the talk of curses. He had lost a friend and patron, and the idea that his death should be reduced to a sensational headline offended him. In interviews, he insisted on the ordinary explanations. Tropical disease, a weakened constitution, bad luck. Yet even he could not entirely escape the chill that came when, after a long day in the tomb, he returned alone to his tent, and the desert wind moaned around the guy ropes like distant voices. The catalogue of misfortunes grew around the excavation like a drift of dry leaves. Some sharp facts, some vague rumours that clung and would not blow away. A member of Carnarvon's family died in a car accident. A radiologist who had taken X-ray images of the mummy passed away after a short illness. A man who visited the tomb collapsed from a heart attack not long afterward. The more deaths that could be even loosely connected, the longer the list became. No one kept a precise tally in those years, but later, writers would claim that dozens of people connected to the tomb had died mysteriously within a decade. Statisticians and skeptics would point out that, over time, any group of humans will experience illness and death. Such is the nature of mortality, but the human mind does not readily accept random patterns. It seeks connections, lines of cause and effect, stories. Ancient curses offered a story, simple and satisfying. Disturb the king, and you will pay. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the tomb, the work went on. The mummy itself, when they finally reached it, was a tangle of linen and resin and incense gone hard with the centuries. The gold mask that rested over the young king's face would become one of the most famous objects ever unearthed. But in the close, hot air of the burial chamber, it was just one more piece of a difficult puzzle. As they cut away the wrappings, separating layers for study, Carter and his colleagues found a body marked by hardship, a broken leg that may never have healed properly, signs of infections, evidence of congenital difficulties. The boy whose images had been painted in perfect health and grace upon the tomb walls had been, in life, more fragile. In another age, he might have survived longer. In his, he became a symbol even as he died. They weighed his heart in absence. Uniquely among many royal mummies, the heart itself was not found in its usual place, and debates would later swirl about whether it had decayed or been mistakenly removed. The heart, seat of memory and conscience in Egyptian belief, was central to the judgment before Osiris. Without it, some said, the king's soul might wander. Perhaps that is why, in the stories that grew around him later, Tutankhamun did not rest quietly. Far from the valley, in cities where snow sometimes fell and chimneys smoked, people who would never see Egypt in person gathered in museums and parlors to look at photographs of the tomb's contents. They saw gold and alabaster, carved lions and falcons, tiny sandals, and intimate domestic items that made the young king feel close and real. They also read, with shivers of delighted fear, the newspaper accounts of the curse. In London, a group of spiritualists held seances to contact the disturbed pharaoh. A medium, eyes rolled back, claimed to hear his voice echoing through the ages, pleading for rest or promising revenge. The details varied from sitting to sitting, but the underlying theme was the same. Human fascination with the dead was not new. It had simply taken on new costumes and rituals. In Cairo, some older men shook their heads at this foreign excitement, over what they saw as a simple truth, that the dead should be respected. They had no need of seances. They had their own prayers. Yet even among Egyptians, the story of Tutankhamun's curse took on a new life. Guides in the bazaars and at temple sites found that mentioning it made tourists lean closer, eyes wide. A tale that once might have been told quietly in the corner of a village coffee house was now a commodity, folded into the broader exchange of souvenirs and stories. Years passed. The tomb was studied, recorded, eventually closed again to daily work. Artifacts traveled to museums, exhibitions drew crowds that waited in lines stretching around city blocks, shuffling slowly toward the shining mask under glass. In those hushed rooms, people stood with their hands clasped, mouths slightly open, trying to comprehend the distance between themselves and that serene gold face. Many of them whispered the word curse under their breath, half joking, half serious as they turned away. In the valley, the desert returned to its patient watching. The steps down to Tutankhamun's tomb remained, of course, and visitors came, their feet crunching on gravel, their voices murmuring in many languages. But there were still hours, especially at dawn and late evening, when the cliffs were quiet and the sand seemed once more to hold its breath. It was in such an hour, many decades after Carter's time, that another figure walked slowly down into the tomb. She was not an archaeologist in the 19th century sense, with a pick and a notebook, nor a tourist with a camera dangling from her neck. She was a conservator, part of a modern team working to stabilize the painted walls and fragile surfaces of the burial chamber. With her came new instruments, lights that did not heat the pigments, lenses and scanners that could see beneath layers of paint and grime, delicate tools designed not to disturb what earlier generations might have brushed aside. Her name was Layla, and she had grown up in Luxor, playing within sight of the same cliffs that had watched Carter all those years ago. As a child, she had heard the story of the curse in the half-serious way of local legends, tossed between kids as they dared one another to run nearer to the closed gates of the valley at dusk. As an adult, she knew better. Or said she did. She walked down the familiar steps into the tomb and felt the air change, becoming cooler, denser, like a held breath. Her flashlight beam ran over the carved doorways, the warnings and offerings written in a hand that had been dust for over 3,000 years. Entering the burial chamber, she paused, as nearly everyone did, in front of the famous mask, now replaced by a photograph and a replica. The original was in Cairo, in a controlled glass case, but the image here still held its quiet power. The golden face gazed outward with almond eyes, lips curved in a calm expression that could be read as peace or distant amusement. Layla had seen it countless times, but this morning, alone in the chamber, she found herself bowing her head slightly, as if in greeting. "Good morning, Neb Kipperura," she murmured. Her voice sounded small in the painted room. She moved to the wall with the scene of Tutankhamun embraced by Osiris, reading once more the columns of hieroglyphs that accompanied it. The prayers and ritual phrases were familiar. What interested her, in a quiet, private way, were the smaller, more unusual lines, places where the scribe's hand had added something not in every tomb. Her fingers hovered near, not touching, tracing shapes in the air. There, along the base of an image of a protective goddess, was a line she had noticed before, but had never fully lingered on. I called upon the guardians of the West to turn away any intruder who came without offerings, without proper words, with greed in his heart. It promised that such a person's breath would falter, that his name would be forgotten, that his path would be troubled in ways he could not foresee. Was it the curse? Not in the modern dramatic sense. It was one of many protective formulas, one thread in a web of spells meant to safeguard the king in his journey. But it had a certain sharpness to it, a certain edge. It made it easy to imagine that Menon or someone like him had written it with clenched jaw and fierce devotion. Layla read the lines softly in the old language, letting the consonants and long vowels roll off her tongue in a way no one had done for thousands of years. The sound felt strange and right all at once, like stepping into cool water. As she spoke, a faint draught brushed her cheek. She paused, the last syllable hanging in the air. The tomb's climate was carefully controlled. Fans and systems worked quietly in nearby passages, but the burial chamber itself was usually very still. She turned, shining her light toward the doorway, seeing nothing but the familiar painted figures and the dim glow of the corridor. "Just air," she whispered to herself, though her skin prickled. She went back to her work, examining small areas of flaking pigment, noting them on her tablet. Outside, the day warmed. Visitors would soon begin their slow procession through the valley, but for now, she remained the tomb's only living guest. In the spaces between her careful movements, she found her thoughts drifting. Did she believe in the curse? No, not in the idea that a pharaoh reached out from the afterlife to swat down specific individuals. She believed in structural damage, microbes, the randomness of bacteria in a cut. She believed in human error, in the stress of international attention on men already ill, like Carnarvon. She had read the statistical analyses that showed the lifespans of those involved in the excavation were not significantly shorter than those of their peers, and yet she also believed that words had power, not magic in the sense of lightning bolts, but power to shape minds, to direct attention, to create patterns where none might otherwise be noticed. The ancient curse, once translated and told, had become part of the tomb story in a way no single object could be. It had wrapped itself around Tutankhamun's name like one more layer of linen, one more gilded case. It had ensured that he would never again be merely one pharaoh among many, but the cursed king, the boy whose tomb killed. Perhaps, Layla thought, that was its truest effect, not on bodies, but on memory. She set down her tools and sat for a moment on the low stool, looking up at the painted face of the king. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked softly, half smiling. "To be famous this way?" The silence that followed felt thick, but not unfriendly. In another time, in a night long before Layla's birth, Menon the scribe had stood in the same room, though the shrine and sarcophagi had still been in place. He had watched the final rituals, the priests passing between flickering lamps, their voices chanting in tones that rolled through the chamber like waves. He had smelled incense, the sharp tang of natron, the wax of candles. He had not known the name of every god invoked, but he had felt the weight of their presence in the rhythm of the words. Later, when the last priest had departed and the heavy door had been sealed from the inside for the final time, Menon had pressed his palm again to the wall and whispered his own quiet farewell. The young king he had helped to guide into eternity would, he hoped, be safe. The curses, he would never have called them that, but the protections were in place. He could not have imagined that 3,000 years later, another scribe of sorts with a tablet instead of a papyrus would stand in the same spot and read his lines aloud. If he had, he might have wondered whether that too was part of the protection. The ensuring of remembrance, the refusal to let the king's name vanish into the endless dark of history. Outside, in the bright world of the 21st century, buses idled, tour groups gathered, guides raised small flags to keep their clusters together. People checked their phones, adjusted hats, emptied sand from their shoes. They were far from the era of Carnarvon's mosquito, yet the old stories still clung. "Avoid touching the walls," the guide would say in accented English, out of respect, and also perhaps to avoid the curse. The last word would be delivered with a half laugh, a little theatrical shiver. The group would murmur, some rolling their eyes, some smiling, some privately convinced that there were forces out here older and larger than themselves. Later, as they sat in hotels by pools or flew home across continents, they would tell friends and family, "I saw King Tut's tomb." They might add, with a chuckle, "I survived the curse." In that way, they made themselves tiny characters in the story. Every story needs new tellers to stay alive. The curse, whether real or not, had ensured that Tutankhamun's story would be told again and again in languages that did not exist when he breathed. Back in the burial chamber, Layla finished her notes. She rose, stretching slightly. Even short hours in the low-ceilinged room could knot the muscles of her back. She gave the painted king a small, almost conspiratorial look. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "We'll fix that crack near your shoulder." No more peeling. She turned off her flashlight, leaving only the soft, carefully controlled illumination set in place for visitors. The colors on the walls shifted subtly, shadows pooling at the edges of scenes. As she stepped toward the door, she paused, feeling suddenly that someone stood just behind her shoulder, leaning in as if to see what she saw. The sensation lasted only a heartbeat. She considered turning, then smiled at herself in the empty air and walked out, her footsteps soft on the ancient floor. The tomb was quiet again. In that stillness, time folded in on itself. Minan's hand releasing a dried reed brush, Carter's hand holding a candle near a broken seal, Carnarvon's hand lifting a cigar in a Cairo hotel before the mosquitoes bite, Layla's hand tracing hieroglyphs without touching, countless visitors' hands hovering, hesitating, then drawing back in respect or fear, and beneath it all, the wrapped hands of the boy king crossed over his chest, adorned with rings and bracelets, fingers thin but carefully posed. If there was a curse, perhaps it was not a beam fired outward from a wrathful afterlife, but a gravity drawing all these lives into orbit around a single brief one. It pulled stories toward itself. Menon's protective anger, Carter's stubborn perseverance, Carnarvon's unlucky wound, Layla's careful reverence, the breathless accounts of journalists, the wide eyes of children in museums. The desert heard them all. Outside, the wind moved along the cliffs, lifting grains of sand that had once been a part of mountains, and would, in time, be dust so fine it would coat the insides of forgotten rooms. It slipped through cracks and around boulders, singing in a voice too low for human ears. In that rustle was the memory of a palace by the Nile, where a limping boy looked up at the stars and wondered whether his name would endure. In that murmur was the echo of a scribe's whispered promise that those who came with greed would be turned away. In that susurration was the faintest trace of laughter, perhaps at the idea that anyone could ever fully control how they were remembered. The tomb of Tutankhamun remained where it had always been, carved into the living rock of the western bank. Within it, painted walls glowed softly under careful lights. Words written in a script that once changed the world still clung to the plaster, their meanings carried forward by patient readers across thousands of years. Visitors came and went. Some left with sand in their shoes and a new curiosity about history. Some left with a small secret shiver when they thought of curses. Some left with nothing more than a photograph and the vague sense that they had seen something important. The king remained. The curse remained too, though perhaps not in the way the headlines once imagined. It lived in the stories that would not die, in the way the world could not quite stop talking about a young man who ruled briefly and then vanished into the earth, only to be raised again not in flesh, but in gold and ink and breath. And as long as those stories were told, around campfires, in classrooms, in documentaries murmured late at night to people drifting towards sleep, the boy king's heart, whether or not it lay in his chest, continued to be weighed and found present. Somewhere in the dark, in a room painted with gods and stars, the silence around his name was never again complete. The sand, which remembered first, would also remember last, and between those two quiet eternities, the world would go on telling of the curse of King Tut's tomb, half afraid, half hoping that some part of it might be true.